Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. The aim of today's talk or lecture is providing a short overview on the evolution of different various transnational ties between the Middle East and Southeast Asia. First, in the first part of the lecture, I'll provide a historical glimpse on the evolution of these transnational ties. And then I'll present a case study on the motives and activities of actually some Gulf charities in a quite unlikely country of the region in Cambodia. These transnational ties manifest in different ways. I'm sure that, for instance, in Kuala Lumpur, or other Malaysian cities, you have seen a lot of tourists from the Gulf. There are shisha cafes, etc. Of course, trade and investment coming from the Gulf and also going from Singapore especially to the Gulf and to other Middle Eastern countries is also significant. But today I will focus on religious ties because this is what I'm competent to talk about. Actually, I'm just saying that if something is not clear, you are free to stop me. Just keep this in mind. So, historically, context between the Middle East and our region in Southeast Asia existed since forever, since the Roman times. Think about travelers, also trade links. But the spread of Islam actually connected Southeast Asia to a system of networks established on the basis of shared belief. This system of networks actually directly or indirectly connected the different Muslim regions. Think about the different Javanese or other Southeast Asian kingdoms that converted to Islam basically in order to be able to be part of these trade links. These contacts intensified due to very important developments. The first one is the Ottoman conquest of Yemen in the 16th century, and also the Ottoman control of the area of the Red Sea, which opened up trade links between the Ottoman Empire and Southeast Asia. And the second development is the colonization of most of Southeast Asia by European powers, Dutch, British, French, Portuguese, Spanish. So especially the Dutch set up shipping networks, shipping services between Southeast Asia and Europe, and these, the ships also touched these routes touched the Middle East. So it opened up the possibilities, increased possibilities for Southeast Asian Muslims to visit the Arabian Peninsula for the Hajj. Also, traders, especially from the current southern Yemen, from Hadramaut, traveled to Southeast Asia and settled here permanently. You can still see you can still see Hadrami communities basically everywhere in Indonesia, Malaysia, and other parts of the region. And of course, these links, like the influx of religious ideas, had tremendous impact on how Islam was perceived here, how the Islamic orthodoxy was conceptualized in Southeast Asia. So one of the most important impacts of Middle Eastern connections in the region and in the transformation of Southeast Asian Islam was the emergence of the so-called traditionalist and reformist divide, or kaum Tue, kaum Mude divide in Malay. I'm sure that you heard these terms. And it happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So how this happened? In the Middle East, especially in Egypt, towards the second half and the end of the 19th century, so-called Islamic modernism emerged. Is this this kind of ideas sprang from an era in which the European and North American world was experiencing a revolution of thought, achievement, and comparatively Islamic civilization appeared to be in decline. So modernists sought to restore Islam to its rightful glory, and in some cases they also wanted to resist Western colonialism by appropriating and integrating the technological and scientific developments of Europe and North America into Islam. So how did they intend to do that? Basically, they claimed that Muslims, in order to be able to catch up with the West, should get rid of the superstitions of the past. They should get rid of elements of the religion that entered in the past more than 1,000 years, and instead they should go back directly. They should read directly the foundational text, the Quran and the prophetic tradition, and by this make religion compatible to modernity. So it meant that, of course, modernists rejected a large body of the Islamic intellectual tradition. They rejected the taqlid, the following of the madahib, the Islamic legal schools, and they told that, well, instead of actually blindly following a ruling from a certain legal school, Muslims should go back directly and interpret what's written in the foundational text. The traditionalists, though, they also organized themselves against this new current, and they claim that the purity of Islam can be preserved, or the purity of Islam is preserved in the works of the medieval Muslim scholars, and in fact, Islam is compatible to local beliefs and traditions. In the Malayan Peninsula, this kind of cleavage appeared in the form of what I mentioned, the kaum Mude and the kaum Tue divide. The kaum Mude means young people, and they are the reformists, and the kaum Tue, they are, well, if I translate to English, these are the kaum Tue, the old people, and this term labels the traditionalists. In Indonesia, I'm sure you heard about Muhammadiyah, which is one of the largest Islamic organizations of the country, and it is a modernist organization, and Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the organization of the traditionalist Muslims. The Southeast Asia and Middle Eastern ties intensified again with the emergence of the Gulf monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the Emirates as significant international players in the second half of the 20th century. So here we have to discuss three three important developments. The first one is the so-called Arab Cold War. Does this term ring familiar to you, Arab Cold War? Okay, so basically, I don't really want to go deep into this topic, but so in the 1950s and 1960s, Saudi Arabia and also the other monarchies were challenged by secularists, leftist, nationalist, Arab nationalist ideologies coming from Egypt or Syria that endorsed a republican form of governance and challenged the legitimacy of monarchies in the Gulf. So these regimes, the Gulf regimes, they turned basically to Islam and propagating Islam, strengthening Islamic institutions in their own countries and also abroad, basically to establish a counter-propaganda, a kind of discursive defense against the Arab nationalist streams and leftist streams coming from other countries, from Egypt especially. The second development we should discuss here was the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So the new leadership in Tehran spread a kind of revolutionary ideology formulated by the readaptation of certain elements of Islam and using certain tropes of Shiism, such as martyrdom, etc., to fight tyranny and Western dominance in the region. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries felt threatened by this Iranian propaganda. Therefore, they intended to counter this by supporting Sunni Islamism, Sunni Islamic institutions worldwide, and setting up charity and educational networks from Europe to Southeast Asia. And the third important development was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And so that time, charities, NGOs emerged in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait and other Gulf countries in order to support the Afghans who were fighting against communism or against the Soviet Union, and also they channeled funds to support the refugees along the border in Pakistan. So basically, these developments led to the emergence of a large Islamic NGO sector in these countries. Also, yes.
If I may ask, what was the impact of Iranian revolution on Southeast Asia?
Okay, so it's a different topic. Of course, it had impacts. I mean, for instance, you can see that until today there is a sizable, of course, still a small minority, but a sizable minority of Shias in, for instance, Indonesia. So they were affected by the discourse of Khomeini and basically the new Iranian leadership. Some of them also received financial support, but I think not as much as those who turned to Riyadh. So basically, this is the main impact, and of course, I was supposed to. I just wanted to talk about this. That basically, because of the Saudi and in general Gulf counter reaction, well, at least partly because of that, Islamic movements, Sunni Islamic movements, also became stronger in the region. So, like, for instance, in the 1980s, part of countering the Iranian influence from the side of Saudi Arabia was providing scholarships to the Islamic University of Medina. Now, in the 1980s, these Medina graduates started to come back to Southeast Asia, and they started to preach. Not all of them, but many of them were preaching something which today we would call Salafism, which is a literalist interpretation of Islam. In certain features, it resembles to Islamic modernism, which I mentioned, if you remember. For instance, in the rejection of taqlid, the rejection of following the Islamic legal schools. Also, in the rejection of local traditions, the rejection of Sufism, for instance, Islamic mysticism. And of course, they are also quite staunchly anti-Shia. But the key difference between Salafism and Islamic reformism is the way they interpret the text. They also claim to go back directly and read directly the Quran and the Sunnah, but they reject logic and any kind of metaphoric interpretation, which means that only text can explain text. So they read everything literally, philologically. For instance, just give you an example that an Islamic reformist or most of the Muslims would say, you know, that the Quran mentions that God has arms. So most Muslims would tell that, well, this symbolizes the power of God, but the literalists say that, well, no, it's if God said that He has an arm, then He has an arm, and you don't have the right to question this. So also, besides providing scholarships, NGOs, charities from the Gulf set up headquarters in Southeast Asia or supported local NGOs, built mosques, also built local educational institutions, or at least contributed in the building of these institutions. Think about the International Islamic University of Malaysia in Selangor, or Lipia in Jakarta, which is basically it is accredited by if I'm correct, I think it was. So one of the Saudi universities, but I can't remember. If I'm correct, it's I have to look up which one. But one of the universities in Riyadh. Jamiat ibn Saud. I think yeah, that one, yes. Yeah. It's called Jamiat al-Imam bin Muhammad bin Saud. Yes, that one. This is the one. Or Islamic, Saudi and especially Kuwaiti and Qatari NGOs, and also the ruling families themselves contributed in the establishment of Yala Islamic University in South Thailand, or now it's renamed Al Fatani University in South Thailand, which is one of the most significant Islamic educational centers in the region. It's actually headed by Dr. Ismail Lutfi Japakia, who is one of the most significant modernist, or some say Salafi scholars of the region. Why does it appear like this? Okay. Also, like basically the intensification of connections between the Middle East and Southeast Asia had impacts on Southeast Asian customs. So here you can see how Muslim women dressed or used to cover or not to cover their hair in the 19th century and the 20th century. This is actually the wife of Sukarno. And now you can see how many Muslim women actually wear the tudong in a more Middle Eastern fashion. This is one example. The other example is the influx of certain Arabic terms into the local languages. I mean, actually, for instance, Malay have a large vocabulary of Arabic terms, but so these. For instance, certain forms of greeting, certain greeting forms are due to recent Middle Eastern impacts. Like for instance, in Indonesia, and I think in Malaysia also, you can often hear like "Apa khabar, akhi," or instead of like using "kamu" or "awak," they use "entom." Like instead of "you," they use a more like entom, which is plural in Arabic, but it can be used in Mali. It can be used as a singular as well. Or you often can hear halek, which is the Arabic. How are you? So one of the main entry points of Middle Eastern flows to the region was Indonesia, the largest and most populous Muslim country, not only in the region but in the world, where due to some internal transformations, Suharto's New Order regime made it possible for Islamic NGOs to gain a foothold in the country. Suharto also supported or at least tolerated the increase of personal piety. In the last decade of his rule, he granted wider space for the expression of public piety in the hope of acquiring an Islamic legitimacy for his rule. Religious activities at university campuses were tolerated. Islamic movements were allowed to raise their voices and organize even demonstrations on distant issues such as Palestine, of course not on domestic issues. This religious upheaval in Indonesia also allowed Gulf charities to increase their activities in the country by financially empowering local groups and institutions that shared their worldviews. The Indonesian Council for Islamic Predication, Dewan Dakwah Islamiyah Indonesia, which was established in 1967, became the main vehicle for channeling and distributing funds received from Gulf NGOs. Among other things, Dewan Dakwah cooperated with the Saudi-based World Assembly of Muslim Youth, and also participated in the funding of several Islamic educational and proselytizing institutions, some of which subscribes to the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood or Salafism. And another notable Islamic NGO that set foot in Indonesia at that time in the mid of the 1980s was the Kuwaiti Salafi charity, Jama'at Ihya Turath al-Islami, or the Revival of Islamic Heritage Society. And actually it became at one point the largest bankroller of Indonesian Salafis. Even today, so one of the largest Salafi network is referred to as the Turathi network, basically, which came from the name of this charity. And another significant wave of Middle Eastern NGOs and the influx of Middle Eastern NGOs happened after the 2004 tsunami, which destroyed Aceh and some other parts of Southeast Asia. So in the last part of this, or the second part of this presentation, I would like to demonstrate how transnational networking works in practice on a case study about Muslim minorities in Cambodia. In particular, I will provide some understanding about the motivations of Gulf-based Islamic NGOs to carry out activities abroad. And so here in the region, you can often hear the myth that Middle Eastern charities are parts or vehicles of a worldwide Wahhabi propaganda. But the reality is a little bit more complex. So I'll talk about this in the next couple of minutes. So, of course, Cambodia seems to be an unlikely ground for Middle Eastern networking in the region, as it is a mostly Buddhist country with only a rather small Muslim minority. Muslims make up about 5 to 6% of the country, which is about 600,000 to 800,000 people. Yet you can discover an exceptional diversity of actors, transnational actors within this community. So actually, myself, in the past 2 years, I have been researching transnational connections in Cambodia, and just let me tell you a story. Well, the story how I started to focus on this issue is that I was a tourist in Phnom Penh, and I was walking around, like coincidentally, I was walking around in a Muslim district of the city, and well, I was surprised to see the logos of those Kuwaiti charities which I researched previously for, which was I touched those charities, the issue of those charities in my PhD research a long time ago, and also I saw the obvious presence of a lot of Malaysian charitable organizations, and then so this is when I started to get interested in the issue that what's going on here, and I kept going back. I built up a connection. We built up connections, social relationships with Muslims in the country. Many of the Muslims actually speak Malay, because Malay used to be the language of religious instruction historically in the country. And also an increasing number of Cambodian Muslims speak Arabic, so I could communicate with them, especially with the religiously educated ones. So this small Muslim minority is also it's not ethnically homogeneous. About 75% belong to the Cham ethnic group. So the Cham is an Austronesian So they speak an Austronesian language, distantly related to the Malay and more closely related to the Achenese. And this is the reason why actually Cham people can relatively easily learn Malay. And 25% of the Muslims, they are so-called Chwea, and they are Khmer speaking. So the Chwea is coming from the word of Java. And Java doesn't only refer to the island of Java in Indonesia, but it also refers to the Malay logosphere. And actually, these, the Chwea are the successors, or the Chwea's ancestors were Malay traders who married Cambodian Khmer women and settled in the country in the past 200-300 years. And so basically, they adopted the Khmer language instead of using Malay. Most of the Cambodian Muslims are Sunni Muslims, and there is about 10, this 15,000 is actually a wrong number. Sorry, I forgot to move the slide. So about 10% of the Cambodian Muslims are so-called Chambani or Imam San. So they are often called as a syncretic community, synthesizing Islamic orthodoxy with local practices, practices that are coming from Cham traditions and also from Hinduism. They are more or less out of the scope of Middle Eastern networking, so I won't talk too much about them. So as I mentioned, the main language of religious instruction among the Muslims is Malay, but Arabic is also becoming increasingly significant. In fact, now you can find Cambodian Muslims who can speak excellent Arabic and don't understand Malay. The Chambani or the Imam San, they instead of Arabic texts, they use Cham text written in Cham Indic script, while the Cham, the Sunni Muslim Cham, they write their language like Jawi or in a form of in Arabic letters adopted to the Cham and the Malay language. So before the colonial era, Muslims in Cambodia actually had quite significant political positions. After the French colonization, they lost their political influence because most Muslims, well, allegedly, according to historical sources, they refused to send their children to French schools, and French was a prerequisite of working in the colonial administration. Yet they maintained their significance in the economy and trade. Now, historically, the relationship of Cambodian Muslims with the majority and with those who are in power was rather cordial until the Khmer Rouge rule that started in 1975. It's debated whether the Khmer Rouge specifically targeted Muslims or not. Well, they targeted basically everyone based on class and the showing of religious piety, let it be Islam or Buddhism. But the result is that the Muslims' religious infrastructure was almost entirely wiped out. So most of the mosques were destroyed. Basically, 100% of the pondoks, religious schools, were destroyed. Most of the religious specialists, ustaz or ulama, were killed. Some of them managed actually to escape, and they ended up in the Gulf, in Malaysia. Some of them also in the United States. So the number of dead is also debated. How many? The estimations are between 90 to 500,000. Now the Khmer Rouge rule ended in 1979 when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia. They deposed the Khmer Rouge, who had to withdraw to some territories along the Thai border, and a new communist regime was established by the regime in Hanoi, the so-called People's Republic of Kampuchea. So during the People's Republic of Kampuchea, Muslims were not persecuted anymore. In fact, they got some support from the government. Vietnamese Muslims from the Mekong Delta also provided financial and other kinds of material support to the Muslim communities in Cambodia. But like the PRK was in general an extremely poor country, isolated by the international community. As you perhaps know, the international community still recognized the Khmer Rouge as the legitimate government of Cambodia. So they had a place in the UN, while the PRK no. So they had basically trade with Vietnam, the colonizing power, Vietnam, and with the Soviet Union. The situation changed in starting from 1989 when the Vietnamese withdrew from Cambodia, and after 2 years of negotiation, in 1991, the United Nations Transitional Authority was set up, which governed the country until 1993, when the elections were held and the monarchy was restored. Now, that time, NGOs, well, in general, thousands of NGOs, foreign NGOs, came into Cambodia. Some scholars describe Cambodia as an aid society, which means that NGOs, foreign NGOs, became like intrinsic parts of the local economies and the local patronage network. So the country basically cannot exist without them. Several of these NGOs came from Muslim countries, especially from Malaysia, from Kuwait, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and also from Singapore. Perhaps you heard about the Iman Foundation. So they are very active on the educational field in Cambodia. They are a Muslim NGO. Also, the political relationship so the relationship of Muslims with the current regime led by Prime Minister Hun Sen is rather good. He is regarded as the protector of the Muslim community. At least they have to claim it officially. Even if you go, for instance, enter to a Salafi school, you can see on the classrooms the portrait of Hun Sen and his wife, without headscarf, of course, which is an interesting phenomenon. And the influx of NGOs also led to the emergence of modern Islamic movements in Cambodia, like the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafism, and the biggest movement is actually Jamaat at-Tabligh. Okay, so I apologize for the quality of the pics. I just made them with my phone. So here you can see a new mosque. It's in Kampong-Cham province, in the village of Chumnik, and this is the center of the Tablighi, Jamaat al-Tabligh. And the mosque itself was built by a Malaysian donor. And this one is also a mosque. And this is how mosques in Cambodia used to look like before the Khmer Rouge. So this is actually a kind of this is basically to show what way transnational actors can impact the Muslim community in the country. Okay, so I would like to focus a little bit on one particular NGO in Cambodia, which I mentioned already, the Kuwaiti Society for the Revival of Islamic Heritage, or Ihya Turath. And actually, before I start, it is a Salafi charity, but before actually I start talking about their activity or its activities in Cambodia, let's move a little bit to Kuwait. And so this NGO was established in 1981 in Kuwait. It became the main bankroller, one of the main bankrollers of Salafism in the world. It's present in more than 50 countries. Not only in Southeast Asia, but in the Middle East, in Europe, in North America. So let's just explain a few things about Kuwait. So it is a quite kind of unique country in the Gulf. It has a kind of powerful and actually working parliament. With competitive and relatively free elections, and as a result, you can find quasi political parties competing against each other. So there are different ideological streams who are among the Kuwaiti political community. You find leftists, you find liberals, but you also find Islamists. There are Muslim brothers, and also there are Salafis in the Sunni Muslim Islamic field. Let's not talk about the Shia now. It would be a little bit more complex. So the Salafis have actually a number of political organizations. The most powerful one is the Salafi Islamic Gathering. And this Salafi Islamic Gathering belongs to a larger Salafi organization. It's a quasi-secret organization, a secret organization that everyone knows about, and the press also regularly reports on it. It's referred to by Kuwaitis either as Ihya Turath, after the charity organization, or Al-Jama'a Salafiyya. Now, Ihya Turath, the charity itself, is also part of this large institutional network. And all right, just a moment. Now, what's the motivation of such a Salafi organization to support Muslims in Cambodia? Well, one thing is that the Cambodian authorities don't put much obstacle in front of them. There are no anti-terror raids in Cambodia. Actually, there was only one, but not against Ihya Turath, against someone else. And also, it can operate quite openly. So the Cambodian authorities don't really put a lot of conditions in front of any kind of NGO to operate in the country. So the access itself is easy. Buying land in Cambodia is not very expensive. Setting up operation in the country doesn't require a lot of investment comparatively or comparing to other Southeast Asian or other countries in the world. So basically, by investing a limited amount of capital, they can demonstrate feasible results. For instance, they set up a large network of boarding schools in the country. They have about 30 plus boarding schools in Cambodia. Sorry again. For instance, they finance iftar during Ramadan. They dig wells in the remote rural areas, and of course they carefully document all of these things. They make photos, they upload the photos to Twitter, they propagate their activities in Kuwait in traditional gatherings or diwaniyas. They use their activities or their results in Cambodia during electoral campaigns, demonstrating that we are the ones who actually take care of Muslims and who are bringing back the so-called lost tribe to the heart of the Ummah. I mean, there is a kind of misconception in the Gulf about especially about the Cham in Cambodia, that they are so distant now from Islam that they need the support of other Muslims to return to their religion. Which is, of course, I mean, it's not entirely true or not true at all. But anyway, this is the image, and it's kind of easy to sell. And so this provides a kind of socio-political authority in order to accumulate political capital and also other forms of social legitimacy. Which can be used to proselytize inside the country as well. Inside Kuwait, I mean. So just to demonstrate a little bit the activities of Hayat Turath in Cambodia. So they have a network of 30, I think now it's already about 35 boarding schools. These are actually among the best schools of the country. They teach both secular and religious subjects. So they have the Khmer curriculum, and at the same time they teach religion in Arabic. But most of the students also learn English. And as a result, because they teach the Khmer curriculum, after finishing high school, these Muslim students have access to Cambodian and Cambodian universities and also universities abroad. Hayat Turath also built more than 100 mosques and surahs or musallas. They also they carried out the project of building a hospital, the Kuwait Hospital, in Phnom Penh. It was not completely financed by Hayat Turath. They only carried out the project, but among the donors were the Kuwaiti ruling family and several other foundations in Kuwait. And also they have a so-called Kafala Du'at program or sponsoring preachers program, which means that they provide salary for Salafi preachers who settle in rural Cambodia and preach their version of Islam. They provide scholarships to Saudi Arabia, and they also used to provide scholarships to South Thailand. Now doesn't exist anymore, but they used to send students to Yala. Ihya Turath is also a political client of the regime, of the ruling party in Cambodia, which means that in exchange of political cover, they finance the electoral campaign of Hun Sen, of the CPP, the ruling party, and the Cambodian People's Party. Sorry, this is the CPP. And also, they themselves endorse Muslim candidates who support in the parliament and in the municipal councils CPP. So, Ihya Turath contributed in the emergence of an Arab-oriented community among Muslims. So I mentioned that, and I mention again that most of the Cambodian Muslims were, or still are, or are Javi-oriented. They learn Malay as a language of religious instruction, but now many of the Cambodian Muslim students learn Arabic instead of Malay. They study at Gulf and other Middle Eastern universities, like the University of Jordan in the Kingdom of Jordan. And also, there is a sharp, there has been a sharp intra-Muslim division due to the emergence of Salafism. And sometimes Salafis in the 1990s violently clashed with those who followed Jamaat al-Tabligh, or who were basically traditional Muslims who followed the Shafi'i madhab. And also the positive impact of the presence of Ihya Turath in the country is the increasing number of university-educated Muslims. And actually, I have to stress here that most of these people actually who graduate in these schools, they won't become Salafis. So they will become basically, if they get to study at a university, they will become basic normal Cambodian professionals who are religious, but who focus more on their career than proselytizing. Okay, I'll stop here. Thanks very much, and let's open the field for Q&A. Yeah, please.
On your first slide about the Kuwaiti presence in Cambodia,
Yes.
You were going over. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So you had mentioned, I think, the emergence of modern movements in Cambodia, like the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafism,
Yeah.
and then there was one other one I think you said was the most.
Jamaat al-Tabligh.
Okay, yeah.
So maybe I should have explained.
Yeah, I was just going to ask,
Yes.
could you please, what is that?
Well, basically, it's also it's a proselytizing movement. Originates in British India, and basically, Tabligh is you can see them going around Muslim neighborhoods, reminding Muslims their religious obligations, ask them to pray regularly, correct their practices, their behaviors. It's a loosely organized movement. Tablighis go to the members of the movement to so-called khuruj, or like a proselytizing tour, which means that they do it every 40 days. How is it? So there's certain intervals when they go for. So I think in every 40 days for 3 nights, and then every year 30. I don't remember exactly, but this is basically it, and it is perhaps the largest Islamic movement actually in the world. It's non-political. Of course, there's no such thing as non-political, but it claims it doesn't have political parties. But actually, if you do fieldwork and inquire a little bit, you can see, for instance, in the Philippines that they in fact, endorse certain candidates during elections, either openly or clandestinely. So. And so one important difference, perhaps, between Tabligh and Salafism is that Tabligh, in most cases, can live quite well with traditionalist Muslims, and they don't attack harshly practices which the Salafis do attack, like the Mawlid, the birthday of celebrating the birthday of the Prophet. The Tablighis are fine with it. They are also fine with performing ziyara, or like certain kind of pilgrimage at the graves of saints, which is a practice which Salafis very harshly also condemn. Yes.
What about the Muslim Brotherhood? Yeah, as we know, Muslim Brotherhood is under pressure in the Middle East.
Yeah.
But what about, because there were Muslim Brotherhood supporters in Southeast Asia, and there are. But what is happening in this domain?
Okay, you're asking me about Cambodia. You're asking me about the wider region.
Wider region, including Cambodia.
Okay. Well, the Brotherhood actually is present since the beginning in Southeast Asia, and well, in Indonesia they have a more or less influential political party, the Prosperous Justice Party, PKS. In Malaysia, for instance, ABIM, the movement of Anwar Ibrahim, was regarded as the representative of the Muslim Brotherhood in Malaysia. In Cambodia, they are also present. Well, in the 1990s, there were in the in the Al Qura school, which was closed by the authorities in 2005. There were members of the Brotherhood. Actually, I met them. Some of them are from Sudan, and they were expelled from the country after the closing of the school. But now the Kuwaiti Muslim Brotherhood is active, and especially their charity organization. They have a very impressive headquarters in Phnom Penh. And interesting, you can see that most of the employees are Cambodian. They are very sophisticated. They speak excellent Arabic and also excellent English. They don't involve themselves in politics at this stage at all, but they have lots of different charity projects and schools in the countryside. They also have, they are also involved in the Cambodian Islamic Center, which is regarded as the best Muslim high school in the country. So generally, the Cambodian manifestation of the Brotherhood is at this stage non-political. It's consisted mostly by intellectuals, by professionals, and mostly they are focusing on educational activities and also like healthcare and other charity projects. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry because I came in a bit later. I'm not sure whether it was covered in the first part. But from the first part of the lecture, I saw that it seems that the reformist or Salafi influence in Southeast Asia came in quite early already. I mean, like maybe in the 19th century or so. So I was wondering, how did it come to be more influential than maybe other forms of mystical Islam, like from the Sufi schools?
They didn't become more influential. I mean, they become influential, but at the same time, Sufism is still influential, especially in Indonesia and also Malaysia. So that still the majority is not Salafi, or the majority doesn't subscribe to Islamic reformism or Salafism. And there is an important distinction I try to emphasize here in the lecture, that that like people like to conflate these two things, and in fact like there are overlaps between Islamic reformism and Salafism. I rather call them, I like to use the Arabic term of la madhabis, because the foundational idea of both is the rejection of the four madahib, or the four Islamic legal schools. But as I explained that on one side of the spectrum, the spectrum of the Islamic reformists, they also claim to directly go back to the text, but they are using this freedom, what basically ignoring the madahib gives them, to match Islam with science, with modernity, etc. They're flexible in interpreting certain fields or certain parts of the religion. On the other end of the spectrum, you find the Salafis who read the text as it is philologically, and who reject any kind of logic or philological interpretation. So whatever is said in the text, in its philological reading, it has to be applied, followed. And then you find everything in between, actually. You find purists in rituals, but at the same time, they can be liberals in politics or other social affairs.
Thank you.
Yep, go ahead.
So, the Islamic Salafism and Islamic reformism seems to have been presented as two strands of an Islamic modernism, as opposed to a traditional Islam, which appeared to me to be presented as a reaction to Islamic modernism. So how do we, because we spoke mostly about Salafism and Islamic reformism,
yes.
How do we try to understand like traditional Islam? Is it what existed before? Like,
well, look, I mean, again, these are just terms I'm using to make things simple, because otherwise I could speak days. But the thing is that, well, the Islam traditional, as they would now call in Indonesia, it's in fact a reaction. It's like a branding or objectifying what is perceived as Islam Nusantara, as a tradition of the region. Or what is not reformism and what is not Salafism, basically. Something which is based on intellectual tradition, which is partly rejected by the Salafis.
Thank you.
So, like the Kitab Kuning, which is used by the traditionalist and discarded by, or at least a part of it is discarded by the Salafis.
Yeah, thank you, Zoltan. I just wanted to ask you, you kindly explained the network between the Gulf states or the Middle East and the Islamic movements in Southeast Asia. But is there any linkages between those people or those movements within South Asia, between themselves, like Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia? Sure. And how strong is it, or are they reliant on the Gulf?
Yeah, it's stronger, definitely, because these countries are geographically closer to each other, and then the relationships are more established. So, like, okay, just give you an example, like. Certain parts of Malaysia, like Kelantan, Terengganu, are historic centers of Islamic learning. So in Cambodia, in Vietnam, you find plenty of students who go to the pondoks, the traditional Islamic schools of these states, and study 1 to 10 years there, and then go back as teachers or as ulama. To basically teach what they learned in Malaysia, in Cambodia. So yeah, the connection, for instance, between main and Southeast Asia, understand Cambodia and Vietnam and Thailand. The links between Indonesia and these parts of the region are currently not very strong. I mean, when it comes to Islamic learning. So basically, the centers are South Thailand and Malaysia. And now, of course, you have the historic learning centers, Kelantan, Terengganu, Pahang, and at the same time, you have a lot of institutions in Kedah, institutions in KL and the vicinity of KL. And also even in Johor. So I bumped into Cambodian students in Johor as well. So it's
a follow-up question. We hear about European Islam, for example, where Muslims in Europe have started to develop their own way of thinking. Are we seeing this also in Southeast Asia?
Well, I mean, look, I cannot answer this question. So I would say that, like, Indonesians, for instance, like to speak about Islam Nusantara, that this is our Islam versus other Islam, which is tolerant and like it's a simplistic, basically contrasting with Middle Eastern Islam, which is perceived as intolerant and black and white, which is again not true, but it's useful for marketing purposes. So yeah, I mean, people like to claim that, well, in Malaysia, or Islam is the Pondok Islam, is the Shafi'i madhab, and the tradition of Islamic schools headed by the Tok Guru in Malaysia, or the Babo in South Thailand, around which local economies have developed, and this is our Islam versus the the so-called Arab Islam. So yes, there is something like this emerging, but you don't have that strong debates currently in this regard. There used to be, but currently as about Islam in Europe, because, well, in Europe the situation is much hotter after the Paris attacks and the influx of migrants.
Hi. Yeah. I would just like to ask about, because you mentioned there's a client relationship between Hun Sen's party and the Kuwaiti charity, right?
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, is the direction just one way in that the charity supports Hun Sen politically, or have they tried to ask Hun Sen to articulate some Muslim concerns within the Cambodian polity? And would these be the local Muslim concerns or the concerns of the charity?
Okay, so it's a good question. Well, yes, well, one thing, the most important thing is that Hun Sen provides cover. so they're left alone. They can operate. They can do whatever they want. At the same time, you find Muslims in the state administration, Cambodian administration. There's a mufti appointed by Hun Sen. So there is an office of the office of mufti was established by Hun Sen himself. Some other scholars claim that this office existed before, but it's a long debate. So I think actually that what they call mufti in the pre-Khmer Rouge era was actually not really mufti, but it was more of a political position. Today the mufti's office is basically maintained by the state. The Ministry of Cults and Religious Affairs has a department that deals with the concerns of Islam. Now the state also provides salaries for the teachers in both the Salafi schools and the school networks of certain school networks of the traditionalists. But look, I mean, I don't think that the Cambodian state is willing or able to address many concerns of the whole population, not just the Muslims. So.
May I
Yeah, sure,
add
please.
something else? You mentioned about the Arab Cold War and the Iranian Saudi, if you like, the Iranian Revolution and the Iranian Saudi competition.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add another thing, if I may. It's just basically, this has always been the case. There is a race for hegemonic competition and dominance in the Arab world, in the Arab region.
Yeah.
Or in the Middle East, and it was, as you correctly said, it was Egypt versus Saudi Arabia, the Arab Cold War, and now Saudi Iranian. But also, I think what helped in this is the influx of oil money that came to the region.
Sorry, I should have to mention it. Should have mentioned it, but like I mentioned that basically the emergence of the Gulf states as among the centers in the Arab world is basically the influx of the oil money.
Yeah. So they became much richer, and then they could do something with that money.
Yeah, but I mean basically this is why the oil money was used for these purposes and not for something else.
Yes, and also if I want to add something, it's also the government's policies to get the religious people to kind of work abroad so that they don't create, if you like, domestic problems. So push them out, let them do, let them go out and spread Islam or help Islamic groups somewhere else. But then, you lessen, if you like, their impact locally to a certain extent. But that didn't work either.
But if you look at the big picture, basically, Gulf, like these, these officials of these Gulf charities and whatever who carried out significant work abroad in Saudi or in Kuwait, they stayed in Kuwait. They sometimes go for one day and they visit an already finished charity project, make some pictures and fly back to Kuwait. Actually, it's an interesting addition that the main headquarters of the Kuwaiti school network is built in an absolutely Buddhist neighborhood just next to the airport. And why? Because Kuwaitis can fly there, catch a taxi or or whatever, go to this Islamic center, visit it, and go back to the airport and fly out. So I mean, they stayed in the country, and in fact, they caused trouble, right? I mean, at least from the perspective of the government. Yeah.
It lessens their because most of their thinking is, abroad. Even though they're not, physically in the country, but they're thinking of, supporting activities abroad. To a certain extent, it didn't work.
But not in Kuwait, right? I mean, maybe that was the intention, but in fact, it strengthened them.
Yes.
Significantly.
Yes. And I just also wanted to add something about the brotherhood. I think the gentleman.
But sorry, let me just add something. That in fact, if you think about the Salafis in Kuwait, it also moderated them in certain ways because it's the general Kuwaiti population when they see that Kuwaiti charities work abroad and build schools, they won't support the setting up of very conservative institutions that only teach religious subjects. You can see that basically Hiaturath, whatever schools they build and control, for instance in Cambodia, but also in Thailand. I also visited this network in Thailand. These schools are actually very modern. They teach modern subjects. They provide a secular alternative future for Muslim students. Most of them won't become religious specialists. So in a way, it opened up the mindset of the Kuwaitis as well.
Interesting. I just want to add something about the Brotherhood. When of course, the Brotherhood started in Egypt and Syria and so on, and they were pushed by those secular regimes. and they were welcomed by the Gulf states with open arms, because that kind of helped them in this Cold War. And they used them for running the governments, for because education system, etc.
Everything.
And they were like their ally until recently.
Then they caused trouble.
When because it's not just about the problem is not with the Brotherhood. The problem is with democracy per se. Anybody who calls for democracy, which the Brotherhood started to do so, they became immediately an enemy. But otherwise, they were their allies in the past.
Many of them were actually kicked out after 1994, right? When they oppressed the Sahwa insurgency.
True.
So I mean, not all of them, but many.
Yes.
And replaced by often incompetent Saudis.
By?
Often incompetent Saudis.
Yes.
Locals.
Yes.
Okay. Any questions? Any more questions?
Yeah. Could I just ask for is there what's the dynamic between the Middle East charities and NGOs and the local Southeast Asian NGOs? Is there a cooperative dynamic between them, or
let me explain. This is also a very good point. So these, like, officially, Middle Eastern charities, they provide donations to local non-governmental organizations. So it means that they basically set up, let's say, Thai, Cambodian, Indonesian organizations, and they channel the funds. And usually they have people who they trust there. So it means that people who graduated in the Gulf, studied in the Gulf, who built up their social network, who have friends among the Kuwaitis, for instance. Like a good example, I interviewed recently the head of the Ihya Turath network in Thailand. Well, he's an interesting and unique phenomenon in a way that he's not Salafi, actually, like not at all, but he studied, he did his university degree in Kuwait. And he learned excellent Arabic, so he managed to befriend, he made friends at the university. And later, these friends became politicians. Some of them are members of the ruling family. Some of them work in the private sector or own companies. So then they are the ones who help him to actually get money from donors. And of course, this quality enabled him to become the agent of Ihya Turath in Thailand. And actually, it works in Cambodia. The Ihya Turath is more controlled by the mother organization in Kuwait, but it also qualitatively it worked in the same way because it is headed also by a person who they trust. All right. No questions anymore? Thank you. Done.